welcome to episode 45 of What to Think, VentureBeat's weekly technology podcast. I'm Dylan Tweeney, the editor of VentureBeat.
And I'm Mark Sullivan. Hi, guys.
And we are joining you from the San Francisco studio of New Relic, our host and sponsor. This week, we're going to talk to Rohit Bhargava, the author of Non-Obvious, How to Think Different, Curate Ideas, and Predict the Future. That is a book, but he is also a futurist, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how he predicts the future and identifies patterns and what you can learn about that, whether you're a marketer or a writer or something else altogether. But first, let's dive into some tech news highlights from VentureBeat.com. So, Mark, I have to start here. The Apple Watch. You were at Apple's event this week, and you got to try on the $17,000 rose gold high-end watch edition. So what do you think, man?
Yeah.
How is it?
I'll tell you, we didn't really learn a lot more about the device than we already knew. It was very cool to try the thing on. I'd never had something that expensive on my wrist before, but the thing is weighty. I mean, you do notice that it's a chunk of metal, you know.
Well, people like that in watches, right? You want some solidity to it.
I think that's a good thing. It did slide around on my wrist a little bit just because of the weight, but
that's not a good thing.
Not a huge thing either, but it is a beautifully designed gadget. And I did get a chance to play around with the software, and the touch screen is really responsive, and the user interface is kind of what you'd expect. Everything sort of made sense in the way Apple stuff does.
Yep.
The real question is, we're all waiting to see how this thing is going to sort of integrate itself into people's lives, and how much we're going to be want to get buzzed on the wrist or see notifications there, and how much we're going to use the health stuff. So I'm very curious about what it's going to be like out in the wild.
What are they saying about battery life? Because that was a big question when they first announced it.
Yeah, they did make a special point to say 18 hours worth of battery. So you're going to get a day's use out of it.
Okay.
That's consistent with what Tim Cook has said in the past. So,
well, that's something I definitely want to test in the real world, because I mean, if you check your watch, just a couple times a day, it'll probably last that easily. But if you're actively using it, getting lots of notifications, there's no doubt that that'll use up the battery.
Dylan, I think that some of the issue in the press is that I think people are thinking about it as if this is a standard tech object, like a phone, but this thing is going to be used differently. So I think maybe the expectation on battery life may end up being a little bit less of a big deal than maybe we think right now.
That's an interesting point. And I should point out that $17,000 is the high end. It actually starts at about $350 for the most basic sport watch.
The 17,000, I believe, is for the Milanese band and the highest end watch. So the band's going to be $7,000. The Milanese band, even though it's expensive, is cool. It's it's kind of a throwback to an earlier classic design, and I think it's pretty great, the styles that they did end up choosing in the bands. So, but yeah, $17,000, that's a chunk.
That's an awful lot, especially for a piece of technology that is likely to be obsolete within the year.
That's what blew people's minds. I think a lot of people, including myself, were thinking about something like in the $5,000 range. Mm-hmm. This thing only has about $850 worth of gold in it. The rest is pure technology and branding.
So that's a lot for branding.
I was pretty surprised when they spilled out that $10,000 number.
All right. Well, let's talk about some other Apple news that you got this week that everybody else didn't have. You got a nice scoop on some Intel working together with Apple again.
Yeah, there's some history there. Intel has really been fighting to get back into or get into the mobile space and catch up with Qualcomm, which makes most of the processors and communications chips in the phones that we buy. And while Intel has been very aggressive in getting their chips into tablets, they haven't been nearly as successful getting them into phones. So in Germany, they have an R&D shop in Munich that's been very busy pumping out new LTE chips.
This is the former Infineon location until Intel acquired Infineon a couple of years back.
In 2010.
Yeah, okay.
And before 2010, Infineon used to supply the 3G chips in iPhones.
Oh, interesting.
The relationship was severed shortly after Intel made the buy. And so now, 5 years later, we have Intel getting back into the iPhone, and not all iPhones. It's going to be a subset of the iPhones that's going to be headed toward lesser served markets like Asia and Latin America.
Okay, so Apple hasn't announced this yet, but your sources are telling you that Intel is working on this. Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds like they might be kind of testing the waters about working with each other again, Intel and Apple.
It could lead to other things. I mean, this deal of putting an Intel chip in these phones is happening now. And but who knows? In the future, Intel would love to get a processor and the LTE chips baked on the same board in a system on a chip for the iPhone. That's their ultimate end game, is to do that and totally displace Qualcomm. So we'll have to watch and see if it goes that far.
That would be interesting if they managed to convince Apple to go that way as well, because Apple has certainly shown an interest in creating its own chips with the A5, A6 chips, and wanting to kind of own that on their own. So I would be very surprised if they went for a whole system on a chip as opposed to just this LTE chip that your sources are talking about.
I think you're right. It'd be very surprising if it went that far.
Yeah.
We'll have to keep an eye on that.
All right. I'm really glad that you're here because you spent last week in Barcelona. Thank you for sacrificing to go to Barcelona to cover Mobile World Congress, which is kind of the biggest cell phone and wireless mobile hardware conference in the world each year. So what were your takeaways from this?
My first takeaway is that, this is a different kind of a conference. This is not like CES, it's not like a circus. It's a very business conference. I mean, there are deals being made, at this conference, and it's a very serious thing for the mobile industry. The main thing that we saw in a lot of different ways this year was a focus on underserved markets. Where are the next billion smartphone users going to come from? And where they're going to come from is markets like India, maybe Latin America, places like that.
Now, we're talking about maybe 2 billion cell phone users in the world right now. And so these companies want to sell another billion to the remaining, whatever, 5 billion on the planet.
Exactly. What they're doing is, this is showing up in the design of the phones. You're seeing a lot of mid-level phones. There were definitely some high-profile sort of premium phones like Samsung's new S6 showed up at this conference. But what you're seeing is a lot of like, $150, $200 phones there that are meant to address these new markets where they hope to find new smartphone users, maybe people who've never owned one before.
Now, you're not talking about the $150 price being subsidized with contract price, but that's the price.
That's the price.
Buy the phone. Okay.
Yeah.
So this would be, for a lot of people in the world who don't have great internet connectivity, don't have computers, don't have smartphones yet, this would be sort of their primary portal to the world of online.
That's why Mark Zuckerberg was there speaking this year. He's got his internet.org initiative is about getting internet service to a big part of the world that doesn't have it yet. And the thinking is that when these people do finally get internet, it might be brought to them in a smartphone. It might be wirelessly. And so that's the reason he was there. And there's just a ton of interest in emerging markets right now.
Cool. For this and more tech news, lots of reports from Mobile World Congress, lots and lots of stories on the Apple Watch and other things that Apple's recently announced, such as their new gold MacBook. Check out VentureBeat.com. You can find all this stuff on our site. We update it many times a day with the latest news. Before we go to our guest, I want to take a minute to thank our host and sponsor, New Relic, which helps customers make sense of billions of data points from millions of applications in real time. More than 250,000 users leverage New Relic's comprehensive cloud-based solution to analyze more than 690 billion data points per day across more than 4 million application instances. I'm laying a lot of numbers on you here, but what it means is New Relic provides powerful insight into your overall environment, from the web to native mobile apps and more. And you can learn more at newrelic.com. And now let's welcome our guest, Rohit Bhargava. He's a trend curator, author of 5 best-selling books, and his most recent one is called Non-Obvious, and he's the founder of the influential Marketing Group. He advises global brands on communication strategy and storytelling. He's a 2-time TED speaker and has done keynote presentations all around the world. Rohit, thank you very much for joining us on What to Think.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about your book first. It's called Non-Obvious: How to Think Different, Curate Ideas, and Predict the Future. So give us the summary of what this book is about. And by the way, congratulations for getting on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list last week.
The concept in a nutshell is that I'm trying to share some lessons that I've learned from working across many different industries on how to see patterns in observing the things that other people miss. And if there's a kind of short message that I want to try and relay in the book, it's that we all have the capacity to use our powers of observation to spot these patterns and become better at applying them to our businesses, our startups, and our lives if we just know what to look for and how to put them together. And so the book was kind of meant to do that.
What you're describing sounds a little bit like what, futurists like Paul Sappho might do. Would you describe yourself as a futurist?
Let's just say I occupy the same space as many of the futurists. But I never describe myself as a futurist, and probably the biggest difference between what I do and and I have some great friends who do some wonderful futurist type of work, but I tend to focus on what I position as the short-term future instead of the long-term future. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the futurists talk about like what's going to happen at 2020 or 2030, and my lens is specifically for a year, and then I reset. And so I do this trend report every year.
Okay, just 1 year out. All right, that's a much shorter horizon, and I would think maybe for a lot of businesses, much more practical.
And it really works if you think about a trend as something that's already kind of happening but is poised to take off in the next year. And that's what really makes a difference, I think, to the decisions that we make and the marketing that we put out there or the business strategy that we use. It's, what's going to affect my business in the now.
It sounds like you're trying to identify the start of something that's going to be growing and sort of latch on to the trajectory that it's going to hit. How do you decide which things to track in the first place?
It's a tough thing. My process is that I actually spend an entire year gathering information. And so, what I talk about in the book is that a lot of my time is actually spent collecting pockets of interesting ideas and then spending time at the end of every year to analyze it and to come up with these 15 trends. Every report had 15. When I first do the first pass, I have like 70 or 80 possible trends. And so it's a process of sort of narrowing that down, bringing things together, aggregating. A lot of it is kind of based on this idea of trying to elevate, come up with bigger ideas, go across industries. So one thing I specifically don't do is I say, well, here's pharmaceutical trends and here's financial industry trends. But, I don't do that. Mm-hmm. I look at trends across the board.
Is this a technique that anybody could adapt and use on their own by reading your book, for instance, or is it kind of your secret sauce?
It's funny that you should ask or position it that way, because for 4 years when I did this report, it was kind of my secret sauce. And the aim of this book is to make it not that way, and to actually share the techniques. So the entire first part of the book really dissects in a step-by-step way the process that I've used, which I ended up calling the haystack method. And the name was derived from this idea that a lot of people think trend curators or trend spotters, they find a needle in a haystack. And what I was describing is my method is the exact opposite of that, which is I spend an entire year gathering the hay, and then I specifically stick the needle in the middle of it and say, this is what it means.
You're hiding needles in haystacks. Okay.
I guess what maybe people want to hear is, can you point to one from the past year or two that you've arrived at that you think has been most meaningful or has brought about the most change in markets?
One of the things that I do every year is I actually analyze which trends worked and which ones didn't. And so the new book has like a deep appendix on the past 4 years, and I really sort of talk about which ones worked, which ones didn't. And I think one of them that stuck around for me so much so that I actually had a version of it in 2014 and then a new version of it this year is something I called unperfection.
Unperfection?
Yeah, unperfection.
Okay.
Last year I called a similar trend lovable imperfection. And it was kind of this idea that when a brand or a product or a person is flawed in a lovable way, we actually prefer that. We prefer it far more than someone who's trying to be perfect. We see this technique a lot in Hollywood films, right? The flawed hero that we end up loving because of their flaws, and we associate with it. And that same emotional connection that works with movies works for startups, it works for businesses, it works for products. And so I was just starting to uncover so many different examples of this coming out in real life.
That's interesting. There was a Wired cover story a few years back. I think it was called The Good Enough Future. It was a very similar idea, which is that a company that does something that's good enough, but is, vastly cheaper or easier or more fun to use, is going to win out over companies that do something really, really well.
Yeah, they even had a cover story called Wrong Design by one of their leading editors, and it was essentially talking about this idea that when you add discord into a perfect design, it actually adds something unique and memorable to it.
Yeah, people actually can relate to that.
Yeah, and that's been around for a while. I mean, that sort of design technique's been around for a while.
There was another trend I came across when I was doing research on your work. You wrote an article about 6 years ago that I thought was pretty prescient. You wrote that the role of a content curator would be one of the big jobs of the future. And I'm looking at sites like BuzzFeed and Upworthy and Mashable and thinking, man, you were spot on, Rohit. Like, what these sites do is content curation, and they're really, really good at it. And the sites are doing really well. I'm not sure that that's a particularly fun or prestigious job, but it's certainly something that exists and has a lot of influence in today's information economy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the stories that I start the book with is something that I was inspired by when I was traveling in Norway, and I had the chance to go to a really strange and quirky place called the Mini Bottle Gallery, which is literally a museum of those mini liquor bottles. Created to kind of show them on walls, right? I mean, the strangest collection ever. And it's got a funny story of a Norwegian billionaire who collected them since he was a kid, and he's got 60,000 of them, believe it or not.
Oh, Lord.
But, as I walk through this museum, which is listed literally in some of those like quirky places to stay in Scandinavia types of guides, right? As you walk through there, you realize that it actually became a meaningful story because it was curated, like a museum is curated. And the curation is what added meaning to the noise. Otherwise, it would have just been a bunch of bottles, and you would have just walked in and been like, okay, that's great, and you walk out. But it was an engaging experience. They had stories. They had a room for the red light district in Amsterdam and all the liquor bottles that came from there. They had another room of the strange, macabre, like horror types of stuff where they had the worms and, bugs and stuff inside of these bottles. And yeah, so what it got me thinking about is, well, curators have been around for a long time in terms of helping us make sense of many different forms and genres of art. But now we're starting to bring that into the business world because we have so much noise that we need the skill set of certain people to be able to help us make sense of it.
Absolutely. I worry a little bit, though, that the curation that it's getting a little bit out of balance with the creation, right?
Yeah, I mean, when you start to contrast beautiful, well-written, long journalistic pieces with 12 things from Home Alone that you never noticed, right? And then the Home Alone article gets 18 times the traffic of the beautifully written journalistic investigative reporting piece. I mean, that's the frustration, right, with anybody who's in the media business.
Yeah, how do you make the long-form quality stuff pay? That's certainly an issue in journalism.
But it does kind of bring me back around to this other thought. In an ideal world, you have a lot of creators and maybe a few curators, and hopefully that balance is somewhat right. But just in terms of recognizing patterns. I mean, if you relate this to the business community, a small business is thinking about, gosh, what are consumers going to want in 1 year or 2 years' time at the end of my present development cycle? Is that kind of where this is headed?
Part of it is what are consumers going to want, and part of it is developing a deeper understanding of what the consumer cares about based on their behavior today. So, one of the most fascinating trends that I uncovered in my research on consumer behavior was digging really deep into selfies. I'm assuming that neither one of you guys are kind of in your teens or early 20s. And anybody who's
I'm
above
13,
that age.
but...
Right. Okay, great. So, well, you sound much older.
Yeah, I am.
But anybody who's kind of outside of that age group, we tend to see selfies as the ultimate narcissistic behavior, right? Like, oh my God, these kids are so full of themselves. They want to take pictures of themselves all the time. And as I started to dig into it and found some fascinating research, I realized that a lot of times that kids in particular, and particularly girls, are using these selfies not so much to talk about themselves, but to build their own self-confidence by showing themselves to the world the way they want to be seen.
Yeah.
And so the trend that I talked about was selfie confidence, the idea that this is just a form of building their own self-esteem at a moment in their lives when that's one of the most important things that they're trying to learn how to do. And it kind of puts a different lens on selfies.
Yeah, it doesn't really sound quite so trivial anymore when you put it like that.
I don't mean to make this creepy, but what does that mean for a business? If you're a digital marketer and you're looking to sort of understand where the future is going. I mean, what does it mean to know that?
So here's a really practical application, right? That now the content that's being produced by these users of all of these devices is visual instead of textual, which means you've got startups and analytics companies like Ditto Labs that are now digging into the visual side of social media posts. And if you, for example, I mean, the biggest thing 5 years ago was every brand was like, oh my God, let's get these social media monitoring tools to figure out who's talking about us. And yet when you post a photo onto Instagram, and if the brand is in the background, but nobody mentions the brand, you miss it. It doesn't show up. And now you've got startups starting to say, well, let's do photo analytics to see what's in the actual photo itself.
Because maybe it does make a difference.
It does make a difference. So there's like a real practical example of how a company is creating a platform that now brands are starting to want to use to understand this visual side of content that's being posted online.
That makes sense. Well, that segues to one of the questions I have, which is, we've been doing a lot of research around this, this shift in marketing from a sort of creative, intuition-driven business to a more analytic and numbers-driven business. Is that something that you've looked at, and how are marketers coping with those changes?
It's really interesting. One of the trends that I talked about so there's 5 categories in the trend report, and one of the categories is marketing and social media. And one of the trends about marketing is what I call the reluctant marketer. And it was essentially built on an idea. I saw this really interesting article about an interview panel with like 5 different CMOs, and Beth Comstock from GE was there, and the Walmart CMO, and a bunch of other CMOs. Mm-hmm. And they were all talking about the role of chief marketing officer and how it's evolved so much that they almost don't think of themselves as the chief marketing officer anymore. They think of themselves as the chief growth officer, the chief innovation officer, the chief customer officer, like all of these other names.
Even the idea of a chief marketing officer is relatively new. I mean, 5 years ago, there were VPs of marketing and there were CTOs and CIOs, but very few CMOs until more recently.
Yeah, and what they're talking about now is the integration of marketing into so many other areas of business that used to be outside of marketing.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Customer care or operations or fulfillment or innovation or research. I mean, these things are crossing boundaries with marketing.
Yes, and then the marketers are driving more technology decisions and playing a bigger role in business decisions. So yeah, calling yourself a growth or an innovation officer is probably a good reflection of that.
Yeah, and I think that, what's starting to happen in that sense is that the promotional marketing that we might have seen some time ago is now taking a back seat to newer trends in marketing, like content marketing, for example, which is founded on the idea that we can actually answer questions and add value to the conversation that's happening already online, and therefore promote our stuff instead of just promoting it in a very, outwardly promotional way.
When we say the reluctant marketer, we're talking about understanding how people view marketing and advertising and maybe taking a more subtle approach to promote things?
I think subtle is a loaded word too, right?
Especially in the marketing context.
Yeah, exactly. People can kind of take it to me, well, let's just be sneakier and pretend like we're not marketing. Maybe people won't notice, which doesn't actually work. If you look at one of my favorite examples of a brand that's just done it right for so many years that we've almost forgot to even think about them, Weber, the company that makes those barbecue grills. Mm-hmm. And if you go into a bookstore, like an actual physical bookstore, and probably most of your readers don't go into physical bookstores, right? Because everything's happening online, right? Uh-huh. But if you went into a physical bookstore and you looked in the cookbook section and you looked at all the books about grilling, probably at least half of them would be published by Weber. They feature Weber grills in the book.
Interesting.
But it's not an ad. It's a book teaching you how to make things on a grill. And the grills there just happen to be Weber, and the publisher happens to be Weber. And that is such a brilliant form of content marketing that's been around for more than a decade for them that we don't even realize it anymore.
You've got me wondering now. I mean, I have a Weber grill at home, and I bought it last summer, and I'm starting to wonder, did I buy it? Because that's just ubiquitous, surreptitious marketing there. And maybe I saw a book in the bookstore. Let me ask you about books, Rohit. You've written 5 of them, which seems like a lot for a guy whose specialty is the future. Are books still a valuable marketing tool?
One of the trends from last year's report was something that I called precious print. It was basically the idea that we print out less, but when we print something out, it's more precious to us. And if you think about the last photo that you actually went and printed out, not the digital photo that just exists on your camera, but something that you physically got, chances are it was probably a pretty good photo, something that you actually cared about.
Right.
And books, I think, are the same way, that we consume digital books, but even my 6-year-old has a preference for holding a book in his hand as opposed to reading a book on a Kindle, right? And this is the next generation, right? Like, this is not the teenagers. This is like a 6-year-old. So I believe in books. I think that's one piece of it. I believe in the power of books. And I don't think that physical books are going away anytime soon. But that said, when you write a book, you don't just write it in a physical format. Like, obviously, all of my books are digital as well. Lots more people buy them in digital format than do in print format.
Well, that makes sense. Rohit, we're almost out of time here, but I want to ask kind of final forward-facing question, which was, if you were picking the job of the future today, what would you single out as a particularly promising thing in the way that you did content curation 5 or 6 years ago?
I may be clouded on this because I am a writer, but the ability to write and publish and create content is going to be a skill set that expands to so many things outside of just the world of media publishing and journalism and now marketing, that I think that is the skill set of the future. So maybe not necessarily the job of the future, but everything from like customer care representatives doing like, I think Samsung launched like a video support service. So now, like, if you are hearing impaired, you can get video support instead of calling into a call center. So like, the skills required for anyone in any of these sorts of jobs is going to require the ability to interact with people and to create content. And so if I had to choose a skill set that anyone should try and value and invest in, that would be it.
Writing and communications and communicating with people.
Yeah.
Rohit Bhargava, thank you very much for joining us on VentureBeat's podcast, What to Think. Really appreciate your taking the time to talk to Mark and to me.
Thank you.
The book is Non-Obvious, How to Think Different, Curate Ideas, and Predict the Future by Rohit Bhargava. Thank you, all listeners, for joining us on VentureBeat's podcast. As always, you can find us online at VentureBeat.com. And if you haven't subscribed to our podcast in iTunes yet, please do so. Just search for What to Think in iTunes, or for that matter on Stitcher. We'll catch you next week.